Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Liminal Space. Today I'm in discussion with Chips Mackinolty. From his early days in the 1970s, protesting in the streets of Sydney against the Vietnam War and being arrested at the very first Mardi Gras, Chips has made a career from his provocative art, writing and activism, and his weapons of choice are generally screen printing, graphic design and radical poster art. Chips is also a journalist and government advisor, and for the past 40 years has been very active in supporting Aboriginal art and artists and using his own art to bring attention to injustices and inequalities experienced by Aboriginal Australians, especially in the field of health. Chips currently divides his time between Australia and Palermo, the capital city of Sicily in Italy, which is where he and I met a few years ago, getting to know each other pretty much while drinking non-descript glasses of red wine. His art is exhibited in museums, galleries and private collections around the world, but you're more likely to see Chips walking the streets, slapping up his posters and artwork in a no-frills fashion that perfectly describes Chips and his general approach to his work and his life. He's a very generous man with a big heart, and it's a big pleasure to welcome Chips Mackinolty to a Liminal Space. Hi Chips.
Hi David.
How are you?
Yep. Good.
So you're in Alice Springs, pretty much the centre of Australia right now?
Yeah, I've been here for nearly 3 years with a one-side trip to Palermo and until the general shutdown, a bit of travel around Australia. But yeah, basically based in the central deserts area of Australia.
Yeah. I wanted to start really, you've had such a colourful and full life, to tell us about where it all started. What was life like as a child and what was your upbringing like?
I grew up in a sort of semi-rural area out sort of northwest of Sydney, just as it was starting to be taken over by suburbs. Um, and I think the real change in my life happened when it was 1966, when my father was doing a PhD at the London School of Economics, and for the middle year of it, me, my sister, and my mum took a boat to Europe, to Portsmouth, and spent a year or nearly a year in London and travelling around Europe. And I think why that was important is that, you know, for those of people who may be watching this who don't understand, Australia in the 1950s and 60s in particular was extraordinarily monolingual, very Anglo, or perhaps Anglo-Irish, because I come from Irish stock originally. And, people didn't know much about the rest of the world. Balancing that, of course, there was sort of, huge migration into Australia, especially from Southern Europe, Greece, Italy, in particular. Later on other countries as well, in the, like Lebanon, but that was, a decade or so later. But while I was in London, mid 60s, I guess I wasn't really aware of this, but it was swinging London at the time. But also politicized throughout Europe. It was just before, May 68 in Paris and France, for example, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the then Soviet Union. And we did a lot of travel. So, I was there realizing there were other languages in the world other than English, which I sort of vaguely knew. My mother taught French at high school, but that was about it. And then being exposed to different alphabets, like Greek alphabet on the boat going over, and learning that, and then later learning the Russian alphabet. And we traveled a lot, as I mentioned, throughout the British Isles, including being in Dublin for the 50th anniversary of the Irish Rebellion. And then in the summer holidays, we drove, before this was a thing really, we drove from London to Moscow to Rome and back to London over 6 weeks. And that was sort of quite extraordinary in terms of, traveling through East Berlin and East Germany, Poland, Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Italy, France, you name it. And that was just a huge eye-opener. And then coming back to Australia, where already in 1966 there was a lot of debate in the UK around things like Vietnam, and that was starting to intensify in 67 when we got back, which led me, quite early, by 1968, going to street demonstrations. And while I was overseas also, I don't know if I know how this happened, but, I started collecting posters, and, urged my mother to take photographs of posters, if they were, not collectible. So I think probably early 68, mid 68 probably, I got involved with a group called the High School Students Against the War in Vietnam, whose nickname was Student Underground. And then I started learning to print posters. And in fact, my first poster was produced in January 1969. So I've been, I guess, in a way, doing posters, for 50 odd years in one form or other. As you mentioned, in different formats in terms of, these days now a lot of it's online stuff, but it's also over the years involved murals and banners and laying out and designing newspapers and brochures and books, and T-shirts. I can't imagine how many T-shirts over the years. And so, yeah, I think 66 was the sort of, I was a 12-year-old, and in lots of ways it shifted my life enormously. And in a curious kind of way, as a 12-year-old, I got around that thing a lot of other Australians my era did in their late teens or early 20s, when they'd go to London and hang out in Earl's Court and stuff like that, and do a bit of Europe and so on. I'd sort of got that travel well and done, and then basically didn't do any more overseas travel apart from a couple of brief things in the 70s, but basically didn't leave the country until about 93 or something like that.
So was that did your parents make a conscious decision to travel with you when you're young to expose you to these sorts of things? Or was it a holiday, or was it sort of, educational? What was the idea?
We went to school. I went to comprehensive high school in called, what was it called? Shit, I can't remember the name of the school. I'll remember it later. And my sister went to primary school. So, schooling kept happening, and that was sort of weird, being at a school in London. I mean, the kids were really, the other 12-year-old kids, a lot of them were really politicized, because most of them were working class or black or Jewish. It was about, and nearly all working class. So it was a really interesting school to go to. It was called Woodbury Down Comprehensive, and I remember now. So we would, do the school things and either catch a bus and the underground, or sometimes walk to school. And it was actually, while I was there was a Russian woman there who heard that we were going to drive to Moscow. She was pretty weirded out by that, but I had sort of a dozen Russian lessons with her before we went, and so I was sort of always pushed to the front of the queue and so on to buy bread or vodka, on behalf of my parents, of course. Yeah, and as I said, it was just quite, it was something I didn't realise in full till 2014, 15, when I was living more or less full time in Palermo, that I started remembering, the Maltese and Italian, southern Italian market gardeners in the region I grew up as a kid, where, speaking anything non-English at school was just not tolerated. Whereas now you've got so much more diversity in schools in Australia, where you have some schools, where there's dozens of languages spoken by, home languages by the kids at school.
So what was that like coming back after that trip back to Australia, back to, let's say, uncultured Australia, and Chips as, a teenager? And was it a sort of a reverse culture shock coming home, and how did you feel?
Um, I don't remember it as that. I think, I was fortunate at school is that, I did okay at sport, and, I did scholastically, academically, I didn't have huge sort of problems getting through and so on. But no, I don't think it was a huge culture shock because, I still was coming home and back to the sort of little weatherboard cottage we'd lived in forever. But I think the thing that did start changing, as I mentioned before, was initially, Vietnam and the impact that was happening on lots of young Australians, whether they were, about to be called up or not. But it sort of, I think it opened Australia up in lots of ways to considering critically the outside world. Before it was always, um, back the empire, send troops to Gallipoli, send troops to, wherever in World War II, and then to Korea, and Vietnam was on once again. But at that stage, there was a much broader awareness and cognizance of, why are we involved in other people's wars, which we still are. We've still got troops in bloody, Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. And, which is palpably obscene. So we haven't learnt the lessons, but certainly that period was when I sort of, and having sort of leftist parents, I mean, they weren't, well, my father had been expelled from the Labor Party back in the early 50s over the communist referendum. But having leftish parents who, were critical of the world, who encouraged, Mum was an historian, my father was a lawyer, but encouraged us to think about the world around us and beyond our front gates, beyond the school gates and so on. Mm. And so they were extremely tolerant of me in the late 60s, early 70s, of quite regularly taking time off school to go to demonstrations. And that broadened over time, from just the war, then became involvements in, sort of things like women's rights, Aboriginal rights, and, towards the end of that period, up until I left school, environmental action was starting in very small ways. So when I started uni, which was in 72, within a fairly short period, I gravitated to a place called the Tin Sheds, more formally known as the Sydney University Art Workshop, and then got involved with screen printing posters big time, to the point when I dropped out in early 74, I still squatted on campus, printing posters just about every day of the year, or helping other people print posters. And I lived in a little loft which had room for a single mattress and a television. Yeah, it was a precarious existence. We lived on, I got 5 hours a week teaching screen printing. So that was, I think it's $6 an hour or something. So I was living on $30 a week. But full-time, working in pretty unholy work conditions, with fumes and solvents and so on, it was quite unhealthy, quite carcinogenic in retrospect. So yeah, that's how I got involved in being involved in graphics. And I mean, you talked about it as being, art stuff earlier, but I think I've also always seen myself in one way or another as a propagandist. And, propaganda is seen by some people as a dirty word. I don't think it is. Propaganda is about persuading people, whether it be with a poster or a slogan or a T-shirt or a film, of other views to take in the world. Some of the people who revile, propaganda are very often the ones that control the means of information. In other words, the means of propaganda. But when people have accused me of being a propagandist, I sort of say, yeah, well, and that's what I've been involved with.
So you're saying you've got a message, you've got a cause, you've got something you want to say, you've got something you would like to see change, and then you use your art or your graphics or your to push your message out there, yeah, as opposed to just art for the sake of being enjoyed.
Yeah, and it can be both, of course. There's times, I've probably about 3 or 4 times in my life I've produced something as a graphic that will last long after I'm dead, and it works. Like it's an image that resonates at the time and lives beyond that time. And sometimes they work because they're a bit horrifying and scary. Other times because they can be beautiful. But the underlying thing is that there is a message here. And for example, the stuff that you would have seen in Palermo, which was based on La Botteria, the ancient market area there, where I became obsessed with creating images of fruit and vegetables. I like to think they were objects of beauty, but it was also about food miles, about sustainability, and tradition and language. All sort of rolled into one.
Mm.
And I guess that's one thing I particularly taken on once I moved to the Northern Territory in '81. Although I did in Townsville start doing it with one particular group, and that is putting messages, the text of messages in languages other than English. And I think that's really important as well. So if, for example, you're addressing a message about the Middle East, for example, you try and use Arabic if you can. Likewise, if you're doing a poster or something about, well, a good example is in the recent sort of COVID-19 pandemic, is getting stuff out in as many Aboriginal languages as possible. And, over the years, I've probably worked with close to 25 different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages, in the material that I've been involved in producing. And that's included, newspapers as well, making sure where you can of getting stuff out in language. And likewise with the stuff that I was doing in Palermo, it was in Italian, but wherever I possibly could, it was also in Siciliano.
Yeah.
The local language in Sicily, which is difficult sometimes because, from one village to the next, there might be a different gender to a simple word like garlic.
Yeah.
Aglio somewhere and Agia in the next valley. So it can be difficult dealing with lots of different languages.
But I mean, in the end, it's about communication, and you're spot on. What good is having this message if you're not actually able to successfully be able to communicate that message across?
Yeah.
And so in that, like going back to that time, because I really think that so much about who you are today is from that sort of that 70s period of political, demonstrations and Vietnam War. What was it like to just be, that was before I was born, what was it like to be just alive in that period, and did you meet with, was a division? Were there people really against you and your others that were protesting against the war?
I mean, it was full on. I mean, like, the sheds were based at Sydney University, and, inside student politics, there were people who were pro-war, though they sort of tended to shut up. But there were certainly people who were anti-feminists, anti-abortion. And, I was at Sydney Uni at the same time as both Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, and had a few run-ins with Mr. Abbott, and successfully with a couple of other people stood in an election and defeated Malcolm Turnbull. So it was for those who don't know, they went on in the last few years to become prime ministers in Australia and overthrew each other in various bizarre ways. But so, I mean, there were definitely right-wing groups, but also, within the left, there were lots of differences of view and opinion between, various Trotskyist groups. And I suppose in high school, I was, student underground, and a group called Resistance were sort of a Trotskyist tendency. But I also had a lot to do with members of the Communist Party in the 70s. In fact, at one stage had the keys to the printing press of the Communist Party, and I'd be allowed to use their camera to do work for poster printing. In exchange from occasionally, when one of them was sick, I'd do plate making or do negs for them. And it's a very different Communist Party when there's sort of, I don't know, semi-anarchist guys allowed a key in to get in at any hour of the night or day. Also, the 70s too was massively changing because of the rapid rise of the women's movement, Aboriginal rights movements, and environmental stuff. Like we were doing stuff around nuclear war and uranium. And at the same time, it was a very live scene with, lots of music. And so I was very heavily involved with doing fundraisers for causes, but which would involve a pool of the same sort of musicians each time. Like Mental as Anything, the very, very early days of Midnight Oil, and bands that have long since disappeared into history. But at the sheds, we would have regular dances, and likewise we'd organise ones at Balmain Town Hall, which would attract thousands of people, and Paddington Town Hall. So it was, it was on for young and old, but especially the young, but sort of. And in thinking about it, I worked closely for a long time with Michael Callaghan, who died a few years back. And we never got together to sort of sit down and write the thing that we wanted to write, which was in part a sort of a thank you letter to all the people who put up with us, who would allow us to squat in their houses or just end up at night because, that was the end of the day. So you'd camp on their lounge or floor or with someone, and so there are a lot of supportive people out there that sort of put up with people like me and Michael and so on. And by the end of the 70s, for quite a few of us, I mean, Michael left to go to Brisbane in 79, I think it was, and then I left Sydney in 1980. In part because of being a bit burnt out, but also just being, just totally poor all the time, and not eating, 3 hearty meals a day and so on, and sometimes going for longer periods without anything at all. Probably too much alcohol, certainly too many drugs, but that's the way it was. So in a sense, I think it probably saved my life to get out of Sydney.
Yeah. I was doing some research the last couple of days, and I realised that, or I've discovered that you were also involved in the very first Mardi Gras demonstration or march or gathering in 1978.
78, yeah. That was an extraordinary night. I think there were 55 of us arrested, and I was pretty much the last one arrested and one of the first ones out because people with bail funds, and that included my parents, in fact, but knew that I always gave my real name and address, sort of thing, and for a lot of gay and straight people who were busted that night, And as it proved the next couple of days later in the Sydney Morning Herald, where they published the names and occupations of everyone who was arrested that night and claimed that that was just normal practice, which of course is bullshit. So as I mentioned, although I was the last arrested virtually, I was the first out, and then I had to go out and memorise these various fake names. And so it's a method of bailing people out. And actually, Mum and Dad had a little, about $300 or $400 in cash to bail me and my friends out at various points. And it was just a little bail fund in a certain book in the library upstairs where, oh fuck, someone, Chips has been arrested again. Whereabouts? Oh God, we've got to go down to bloody Maroubra to bail him out, sort of thing. So they were extraordinarily supportive, as you can imagine. And that night, I mean, the police, and they finally did apologise, I think last year or the year before, were just totally vicious on that night, and just were more interested in bashing people up than arresting people. And being King's Cross, where it got to its height, regular King's Cross goers started fighting the cops as well, because they could see what was happening. And some people were, scarred for life. They lost jobs. A couple of teachers, some nurses, and various other people lost their jobs as a result. And in the end, the charges were dropped against most people, not against me. It was a very vicious night. And if I'm still alive, it'd be good to go to the 50th anniversary. That's a few years off now.
What was the, like, it was an organised gathering and with a permit or no permit, or what were the arrests for? Like, I really don't know much about that night at all.
It was billed as the Mardi Gras, and it was just a street, and they did have a permit down Oxford Street. And then when it got to Hyde Park, people pretty much spontaneously decided they'd head up to the Cross and up William Street. And the main slogan that was developed as the march was coming down Oxford Street, and then certainly, in greater force as it went up William Street, down Darlinghurst Road into the Cross, which was stop police attacks on gays, women and blacks. And of course, that is exactly what the cops did that night, quite indiscriminately and savagely. I did that, nearly all of it in bare feet, because my thongs broke at the top of William Street and so on. But anyway, it was a thing of its times, where you had sort of, extraordinarily corrupt New South Wales police, and bitterly antipathetic to demonstrations in any case. And to a certain extent, seeing a gay march, I think, was sort of the last straw for them. And, because it just took them to the very core of their being, that, oh, Jesus, there's all these poofters marching now, let's do them over. And that's what they attempted to do.
The people that I've been speaking to, there's a theme that keeps coming out, which is this idea of like planting a seed for change that may not happen immediately. It may not happen for some years or decades. And it's interesting to hear that story then of the context of, in 2017, I think it was, gay marriage was legalised in Australia. So you've gone from the experience you've just said, and then now almost 40 years later, is this what continues to give you kind of hope and motivation, that that doing something now, you need the battle, you need the struggle, you perhaps need the defeat in order for change to occur, maybe some generations down the track?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that dialectics, as it were, goes through history, is that if it weren't for, well, to be really sort of maybe a bit simplistic about it, but if it weren't for people like Martin Luther King in the early 60s, And now we've still got Donald Trump, still a long way to go, which is why the Black Lives Matter stuff has been so sort of important and strident, in recent times, because there's always a long way to go. But you're right, there are seeds, and the only thing you can do really is to keep going. Yeah, to take an example of someone, like um, Jack Mundy, who died earlier this year, who was a member of the Communist Party and leader of the Builders Labourers Federation, who did the first green bans in the world, i.e. taking strike action to protect the environment. And it was, bizarrely, it was in its first outing, was to protect some bushland in a nice middle class area, in the North Shore of Sydney. But from that, green bans, grew and grew. But green bans and green politics are very much all over the world came from the action of those trade unionists back then. Filmmakers like Pat Fisk, who were making films about those struggles against developers and in terms of saving the environment and so on. And yes, there's nothing comes from, it just doesn't drop out of the sky. It does involve long struggles, and if you can be a propagandist for doing that, that's fine by me.
Mm. And you use this word propagandist. I love it. I'm just curious whether you would use that in place of the word activist for yourself. Is it sort of the same thing, or is there a difference between these two?
Oh, you can be an activist, and you're a propagandist by your actions, whether it's a sit-in or tying yourself to a tree or not registering, for the conscription and so on. I guess I'm using propaganda in a sort of a somewhat narrower thing to describe, writing, words, visual outlets, again, whether that's, a piece of graffiti on a wall through to a movie, to a film, documentary, the sort of work that you're involved with. I always loved a line that was on the front lawn at Sydney Uni back in the anti-Vietnam days, is, it's better to be a propagandist than a proper goose.
Fair enough. Well, it's funny. I actually use that. I use this word propaganda for my own filmmaking in a way. Not actively, but some people say, oh, you know, I'm independent, so therefore that gives it some sort of credibility more. And it's like, well, hang on a second. It's still my propaganda. Like the maker or the creator or the person with the vision of anything still has their message that they want to get across. So that resonates a lot. That's probably why I'm sticking with that point. I'm interested to hear more about it. And what about 2020 and the role of artists and propagandists, if that's a word? Is art and propaganda still playing as important a role in change and in social and political movements?
I think hugely. And the propaganda that's in the hands of the COVID-19 denialists as well. There's sort of, the conspiracy theories around 5G and stuff like that. Those are forms of propaganda as well, to try and take people's attention away, for example, from, a lot of the root causes of why COVID-19 has hit so many places so badly. And, case in point are the aged care homes in New South Wales and Victoria, which have allowed to become these sort of centres of private profit rather than of care. And I think, you know, this is a huge sort of potential boost to, in fact, deprivatising, you know, quite a lot of things in society, because they've been demonstrated really clearly that they don't just not work, but they also kill people. And as we know from all over the world, it was spread initially by people with money who could afford to travel around the world and stuff like that. And that includes rich Chinese tourists as well as rich Americans, you know. But the way it's been dealt with just shows that, well, the way it's happened is that it's overwhelmingly affecting poor people. And people who are poor will have underlying conditions, other morbidities, which, you know, this particular virus makes people very susceptible, which is why in the context of the Northern Territory, the fears around COVID-19 you know, getting into Aboriginal communities who already have the kinds of conditions, you know, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and so on, plus massively overcrowded housing, are just sort of almost scripted for COVID-19 to deal with really savagely. And it happened, though not for as long as, or extensively, back in, you know, swine fever a decade or so ago, where the death rate among Aboriginal people was much higher than the general population. And that's where, in the current context, the Aboriginal community-controlled organisations have been using propaganda in ways better than the government ever has been able to. You'll note it yourself from being in Melbourne, where there is ongoing criticism of the non-delivery of public health information in migrant languages, especially migrant groups, you know, that are fairly recent to Australia, but also among, you know, Italians, for example. And how absolutely poorly the communications have been. Whereas in the Northern Territory in particular, Aboriginal organisations have taken it on themselves very much to get material translated into language. And, you know, as music videos, as informational videos, as posters, as T-shirts, you know, and that was starting to happen in late March. Now, you know, at some stage, I'd really like to see the data on when any Australian government started producing stuff in migrant languages. My suspicion is not until at least mid-April, if not later. And they're still fucking it up, as was found in Melbourne just last week.
Did you see that last week? They realised there were all these mistakes due to bureaucrats using Google Translate to translate languages and just coming up with nonsense, basically.
Oh, and producing stuff in Farsi for Arabic-speaking audiences.
Yeah.
And just because it's a very similar alphabet. Oh, yeah, that must be Arabic. Yeah, pump it out to them. It's just been...
Iran, Iraq, one letter difference, assume the same language, but not.
They all look the same and they don't speak English, fuckers.
So, but you beautifully put it. It seems that in difficult times, it's like people rise to the occasion, if that makes sense, rather than governments and rather than elected officials.
And I think that comes down to a really old word. I think it might originally be French, but the word solidarity is where that comes out in the face of adversity. And there are millions of stories around the world of neighbours reaching out to each other, you know, to help each other, knock in the door and sort of saying, look, you know, do you need the shopping done, or, you know, whatever. Just at that very communal sort of level, that solidarity is really spelt out. And also stuff that's still developing, but, you know, among health workers, you know, looking out for each other and so on. And again, there's this fantastic propaganda, again, being produced as posters and so on by the American equivalent, I can't remember what it's called, of the Australian Nursing Foundation. where they've been producing posters which are aimed at solidarity with health workers, with nurses, with allied health workers, with doctors, and so on. Because they've in so many ways been the front line, but then there's also the unsung heroes, as it were, the drivers and the people on the telephones and stuff who are working their rings off to sort of try and defeat this problem and these series of problems.
You have this amazing ability to be able to cover, to be across so many issues.
Yeah, but as to people like you, I mean, it's that thing of, not hiding from the world.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm critical of some artists, is that I mean, they may produce beautiful things, but they're disconnected in a sort of in their own bubbles, in their own universe, and don't appear to notice anything happening around them. And I'm not built that way. I find it much easier to, I don't know, respond to things as they happen, and hope you don't fuck them up. But if you do, try and fix it up later.
And do you see that the role of art is to be political, and the role of art is to engage and to provoke and to be propaganda, or is there also a place for art's sake?
I think things can be both. Not often, but I mean, I think some of the pieces of work by Therese Ritchie, for example, are extraordinarily beautiful, but they're also really confronting. And they can be both. And I mean, yes, it is the role of artists and crafters and so on, and filmmakers for that matter, not to shy away from creating things that are beautiful and in a sense for their own sake. But by the same token, there are times when you have to say things and be blunt about, what it is you're here in the world for. And it's not to produce necessarily, another diamond brooch for Her Majesty the Queen. And, I guess that's where I draw the line.
Yeah. And you're talking about your work with Therese Ritchie. It directs me to a project I think called Get Well Soon, A Diagnosis from 2014, which for me is a totally intriguing and unique project and art exhibition. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was a project all right, back in 2010, we had a sort of retrospective of our work, which we called Not Dead Yet. But we had been thinking for some time, because she was very much involved with around producing health materials about, for example, education stuff around, organ donation, and one of the particular areas of that where until very recently, Aboriginal people on dialysis, the chances of them getting a transplant were a fraction of the chances for a white fellow. People like you and I. So we came up with the idea of getting well-known Australians and put them on dialysis. So we produced 14 images, including one of each of us, all on the machine, to put the view that their lives would not be possible if they were spending 5 hours a day, 3 days a week on this fucking machine. So we put people like Tony Abbott and Archbishop Pell and John Howard, various odds and sods, on dialysis. And we also included, the singer Paul Kelly and the female actor.
Kate Blanchett.
Yeah, Kate Blanchett. We put them on the machine as well. And we made them look as beautiful as possible. Like they're on the fucking dialysis machine. They're rigged up to various stuff, um, and we weren't making caricatures of them. They were realistic images of them on dialysis, and it was very much about their lives would not be possible if they were similarly afflicted.
There were some things that I discovered that was extraordinary about chronic kidney disease and in Aboriginal communities. Kidney disease is experienced in remote areas of Australia at 30 times the national rate. And Aboriginal people are 7 to 11 times more likely to die from chronic kidney disease. This is extraordinary.
Those figures haven't got any better in the last 5 years since that information came out, and I guess it comes down to it wasn't on for long. We sold very few of them because you can imagine it. Not many people would like to have a portrait of Archbishop Pell on a dialysis machine sitting in their lounge room. The people who really liked the show were dialysis patients who came and saw it, and dialysis nurses who came and saw it, and they just really loved it. And it's a pity we just, it's partly my fault because I was heading back to Palermo that we just didn't get our shit together to tour it, but it's there online somewhere.
And what's the, without going too deep into it, why are these statistics the case? Why, is Aboriginal 30 times more prone to getting chronic kidney disease than you or I?
The same reason why, if it hits Aboriginal communities, COVID-19 is going to take more lives, and it's because of social determinants, and that means housing. Is a major thing. Diet, employment, education, all the things that various politicians for some years now have talked about closing various gaps on, when there's been very, very little movement at all across most of those measures. High rates of imprisonment, especially juvenile imprisonment. All the things that, as I mentioned earlier, talking about COVID-19 around the world, COVID-19 is killing people whose social determinants make them vulnerable to this latest pandemic and so on. And if you look at the countries that have the non-developed nations or underdeveloped nations, how you want to class them, the ones that have got good health systems, public health systems, have done far better than the United States, for example, because its public health system is, chronically ill. And we're doing well in Australia, comparatively speaking, because we've got a reasonably good public health system. It's still not as good if you come from poorer backgrounds.
Yeah, but I mean, it's showing the most vulnerable, and it's not even just on racial or cultural lines. It's in Melbourne where I am now, it's the elderly care homes. It's most vulnerable in so many ways.
Yeah.
And when I came to visit you last year in Alice Springs, one of the main things that I was so shocked about just walking around the town was you mentioned diet. That was something that was just appalling to me when I saw people that obviously are struggling and with big buckets of Kentucky Fried Chicken and chips and it's just it's like anything. The most vulnerable, or the people that can't deal with these issues are the ones that are always the most impacted.
Oh, and things like Kentucky Fried is the cheapest form of protein and carbohydrate intake. It's just the way it is. And, sort of mass-produced crap, which makes people ill in the long term. It leads to obesity. Guess what? Obesity is a condition which makes you more vulnerable to kidney disease. and COVID-19. So it just feeds on itself.
It's just a
Um,
crazy world we live in where it's cheaper to feed your family chicken and chips than it is a salad sandwich. You know, that's the,
exactly, and cheaper to drink Coca-Cola than bottled water.
yeah.
Um, which is it's a fucked world.
It's a fucked world, but you're doing a pretty good job of trying to navigate it and make sense of it and
Yeah,
leave an
try to unfuck
let's try and unfuck it, leave an impact, you know. And that's a beautiful segue to, because we're talking about food and diet. You and I met in Palermo. You and I met in the Vucceria, which is the oldest market area in Palermo,
it.
of where you were very comfortable most days, sitting in the street, eating and drinking and talking to the locals in, fair to say, limited Italian, but you were really embraced by the local community. And just wonder if you can talk about what you were doing there and the sort of the, for your life and the projects and this relationship to the market and the fresh food.
I mentioned earlier that I haven't done much travel, as a younger person, apart from, when I was a kid. But from about 93 onwards, if I did do overseas travel, one of the things I would make sure I'd do was just go to one place rather than, if it's Tuesday, it's Belgium. If it's Wednesday, it's, France or whatever. Because I don't think you can get any real notion of where you are if you're just constantly on the move. And I first went to Palermo actually only for 2 days. I was living for a while in Reggio in Calabria. Um, and I thought I'd really like to come back here. And so I did in 2005 for nearly 3 months, and again in 2007 for close to 3 months. And then when my father died in 2013, my sister rings me and sort of says, "Oh, well, there's not enough money to, be rich on, but there's probably enough money to sort of take a year off work." So I ended up stretching that to 4 years. And very quickly on, I mean, I break my visa all the time. You're supposed to only stay there for 3 months and go away for 3 months, but I never bothered about that. So I rented a place in Palermo in the Butcheria, and that was my base for the best part of 4 years. In between some trips back to Australia for exhibitions, and I don't know if I was expecting anything much, but I just decided I'd just hang in. And you're immediately identified as a foreigner, but I'd like to think by the end of it, I was at least their foreigner. And I mean, Southern Italians, there's this sort of extraordinarily friendly in any case. You can be walking down a street and total strangers will, salve, buongiorno, etc. And particularly in the old parts, you were living across in Ballarol. There's that thing of strong thing of community, which only might be sort of a square kilometre, and might only house a couple of thousand people or something. But everyone knows each other, is related to each other. Um, like I mean, the reason why there are so many diminutives and so on for, personal first names is, you usually name your eldest son after your grandfather. And in a small knit community, it means there's so many people called Salvatore that, there's all these sort of nicknames and other names and variations on, that particular name and so on. And of course, having a weird name like Chips was a lot of amusement, especially among kids when you translated what it meant into Italian. But I did get very close to people at some particular bars and trattoria and da Totò in particular. And then it actually started with an image I'd done in Australia of a threatened bird species in Kakadu. which I did as a sort of fundraising print to fund more research out of Charles Darwin University into that particular bird and its habitat and so on. And I printed out a couple just to see what they'd look like. And I thought, oh, I'll paste it up. So I pasted it up with their permission, not that it was their wall, of Datoto. And people really liked it. And then I did another couple and another couple. And then other local businesses would sort of say, oh, look, come over here, you know, we sell meat here. How about doing some images of meat and so on? So I think by the time you got there, I'd sort of, you know, I had stuff all over the joint. And it was amazing because, you know, no cops, no business owners, no council stopping you. And in fact, people welcoming it. And then you'd be going out at one stage at least once a week, you know, at best once a fortnight to do another paste up. And people would stop and watch it and make comments on it and so on. So it was, and some of them were, in a sense, decorative or just describing the business. Like, you know, there was a, what do you call those? A panel beater, you know, that I did. I invented a uniform for him and you know, and a jacket for him, and likewise with a bar up the road that I did stuff for and so on. But also then I was also starting to work on my work around fresh food in the market. So, you know, as I was producing those, I'd paste them up as well in the market areas. And for I think 3 years in a row, I did a Christmas poster, which I'd paste up around the district. And people would just sort of say, no, put it on my wall, you know, put it here, sort of thing, you know. So it's such a different sort of place to be pasting stuff up. And then later on, doing some paste ups in other parts of town, again at the invitation of those neighbourhoods. So it was a lot of fun, and you know, I worked my ring off on producing the images. So it wasn't as if I was just sitting around idly drinking wine at the restaurant.
Do you see art as a way of, I mean, you said that the communities are really open and embracing people, and that's absolutely true. But I mean, my own family background is from southern Italy. I know that before embracing, there can also be real skepticism and sort of strangers, of outsiders. Once you're in, but it's sometimes hard to break that barrier. Is art for you also a way of interacting and engaging with local people where perhaps even you don't have the language to communicate?
I think that certainly helped me in that context. And it certainly helped me when I spent a couple of months 10 years ago in Beirut, where again, I started doing portraits of the people who, at the place where I was staying. And so, you know, they got involved with their own portraits or talking about the portraits of, you know, other staff members and so on. So yes, I mean, it can be a way of engaging for sure. But I think it also sort of says stuff about, you know, that you're not there to be, what's the word? You're not there just to harvest personal experiences and go away. That, you know, you used the term earlier about, you know, sowing seeds and so on. You know, it'd be nice to think that, you know, the seeds you've sown by what you've done, you know, can survive and grow. For example, in that one area down our laneway, which just used to get full of rubbish and so on. So me and Bernadette started sort of planting lemon trees and orange trees in that little laneway to sort of, and in one case, a children's story that I wrote about pigeons, of all things. And so people were, you know, taking a more active role in stopping rubbish in that particular area, and getting onto the council if, you know, people were dumping things that were too difficult to remove. And then another mural painter did some work on another wall, just another little alleyway. And then, of course, I mean, the street art in Palermo is fantastic, and there's this camaraderie around it, and there's people from all over the world who do street art there, and there's all these unwritten rules about not covering other people's work unless they've been there for a good 2 or 3 years, and there are also things you can commemorate things like the patron saint of Palermo, Santa Rosalia. I produced a number of images over those years of her, and in particular when there was that terrorist attack in Barcelona in, was it 2018, maybe 17, and did a sort of diptych of the patron saint of Barcelona and the patron saint of Palermo together, with a thing in Italian saying, solidarity with Barcelona. And an Australian artist who was visiting, who's got that expertise, she put sort of gold leaf on the halo around the Spanish saint. And there's just no way that anyone was going to touch that, like it was looked after, and people would take photographs of it. And then, of course, as you know, got involved with doing paste-up murals of kids in the area. And although I said it is a community, it's also a series of communities, kids, little gangs of kids, I guess. So, I'd do a paste-up of one gang, and then the next gang would say, well, what about us, So it was sort of quite wearing, actually. Towards the end, all these kids just wanting to be pasted up on the wall.
Oh, I mean, yeah, obviously that's where we met, and we spent a lot of time. I was carrying your paste and taking photos for you and things like this. So, you made a huge impact. And I think, maybe we should, let's look at finishing on that sort of that sentence that you said about sort of planting seeds. And I wanted to ask you one final question. You've got a hell of a lot of life and art and propaganda still in you. However, if there'll be an end of the day at some stage, what would be the one thing or multiple things that you would most like to either be remembered for or have left some sort of legacy of your life?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's been 3 or 4 images which will outlive me, which is, fine. So they'll, be reproduced and reimagined, down the years, sort of thing. And some of them, that's already happened too. I think, what I'd be most like to be remembered for is embracing languages other than English in the graphic work that I've done. Because I think that, as I mentioned right at the beginning, I came from a very monolingual childhood, was introduced to the existence of all these other languages. And I ran into this Polish chef here the other day, and I just realised and I thanked him in Polish, and he was sort of completely bowled over because there are no other Poles in Central Australia, and fuck all in Australia for that matter. And I don't know where it came from. I just went back to my childhood, and suddenly I knew how to say thank you in Polish. And I've never done a poster in Polish, mind you, but maybe one day.
It's super interesting. I would interpret that and interpret you and interpret my time with you as being respectful. That is because it's the opposite of thinking that you put yourself above anybody else and, expecting others to know your language and
You're not there to harvest other people. You're there to plant seeds with them.
Brilliant. Well, I very much look forward to a whole lot of planting seeds. Just as much as that, I very much look forward to sharing a glass of wine with you in Palermo.
Yes, a bottle of Nero d'Avola would be
A
beautiful.
bottle of Nero d'Avola would be beautiful. So I say chin chin and salute, and
Ci vediamo.
ci vediamo. Thanks so much, Chips. It's been a pleasure, and take care of yourself, mate. Thanks, brother.
Yeah, you too, and to all your family and friends in Melbourne. It must be shit at the moment, but you'll get through it.
Thank you. It is, but we will. Thank you.
Okay, stay safe.
Cheers, mate. Likewise.
Bye.
Many thanks for watching. I'd love for you to be notified of new episodes, so subscribe and hit the bell button below. Like and share this video, and feel free to leave any comments or questions below. You can also visit liminalspace.earth to discover all episodes. But for now, many thanks again, and I'll see you next time in a liminal space.